So today's is Lesson 3, our created solar system, Part 2, and we'll talk about the gas giants. And I'll be using video snippets from Spike Pizarro's Astronomy, our created solar system. So the outline's pretty simple. The gas giants. Remember last week we talked about the terrestrial planets. That's Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. Now we go further out into space. And we're going to discuss what you are not being told about Jupiter. We'll also talk about Jupiter's moons. What you're not being told about Saturn. What you're not being told about Uranus. And what you're not being told about Neptune. So this lesson will discuss those 4 planets. So let's talk about the first gas giant, Jupiter. Has everyone heard of Jupiter? Okay, everyone's nodding their heads. Good. It's sometimes called the king of the planets because it's the largest planet in our solar system. After Jupiter, we have Saturn with the rings. We'll talk about that. Neptune and Uranus. Uranus is to the right of Saturn, and then Neptune is the last planet. Now, all 4 of these are bigger than Earth, and you can see Earth in comparison in size to the 4 gas giants. So they're much, much bigger. In fact, Jupiter's mass is greater than 2 times all the other planets combined. So Jupiter has a beautiful, intricate cloud swirling over its surface. You can see in the picture here. Now, what I want to highlight is the Great Red Spot. It's a huge storm system. You can see that circular movement. And it's existed for hundreds of years or even longer. Ever since we had telescopes, we were able to see the Great Red Spot of Jupiter. The red spot is actually bigger than the entire Earth, and you can see the comparisons there. Jupiter also has huge electrical storms, thunderstorms, on its surface. And Jupiter is a very violent place. I have a clip here that Spike Pizarro will discuss about how the secular model evolution can't explain Jupiter. This is the longest clip, but I felt it was good to play this. It goes about 7 minutes. I want to prepare you for it. But it really shows you dramatic pictures of Jupiter and explains why the secular model can't explain it.
Just like all the other planets, Jupiter contradicts secular predictions for our solar system. To produce a planet this big, you need a lot of raw materials, and the secular models can't supply them. According to the most popular models, Jupiter had to form a bit differently than the Earth. Like the Earth, it supposedly started when some planetesimals, or asteroids, formed from the solar nebula and gathered together. But these planetesimals had enough mass, and therefore enough gravity, to collect lots of gas from the solar nebula too. They became the core of this giant planet, and after several million years of gas collecting, Jupiter had formed. Well, that doesn't work, for several reasons. First of all, Jupiter's core doesn't match this scenario. The Juno mission found that Jupiter doesn't have a distinct rocky core. Instead, it appears to be more like thick sludge, a fuzzy core, without a sharp boundary between it and the mantle. Before Juno arrived, there were several popular ideas about Jupiter's formation, but a fuzzy core doesn't fit any of them. As one paper said, none of the scenarios we consider lead to a fuzzy core that is compatible with interior structure models. It is very challenging to explain Jupiter's dilute core from standard formation models. So, some scientists are suggesting that Jupiter formed with a normal rocky core deep inside of the giant planet, the kind of core that their models predict. But then, all of a sudden, there was an asteroid collision. Supposedly, there was a huge asteroid with a specific size and mass, and in this random event, the asteroid came in at exactly the right speed and at exactly the right angle, and it hit Jupiter head-on, exactly in its center, and then penetrated all the way in, and then precisely hit the bullseye, the middle of the core deep inside the giant planet. Under these precise conditions, this giant impact would supposedly disrupt Jupiter's core, which would then spread out and form the diluted core that we see today. Now, does this sound like a reasonable scientific model? Or is it merely a contrived just-so story? But this is only the last part of a larger issue. Before you could even talk about how a solid core can turn into a fuzzy core, you'd have to explain where the asteroids came from that built the solid core in the first place. As we've already seen, the secular model can't make asteroids out of gas and dust. But for Jupiter, the problem is even worse than what we've already discussed. A paper in Nature discussed the planet-building process and said, how this process continues from meter-sized boulders to kilometer-scale planetesimals is a major unsolved problem. Boulders are expected to stick together poorly, that's the problem we discussed before, and now here's an additional problem, and to spiral into the protostar in a few hundred orbits owing to a headwind from the slower rotating gas. Remember, these planetesimals are supposed to be forming in a giant cloud of gas. As they move through the gas, it creates a headwind, which slows the rocks down. And when an orbiting object slows down, it moves inwards, toward the object it's orbiting. As a JPL NASA press release explained, the problem with this tidy little theory is that when the burgeoning space rocks grew to about 1 meter in size, orbital mechanics tells us the gas commingling with them in the protoplanetary disk should have acted like a brake, slowing their velocity appreciably. Their orbital speed having been cut, these filing cabinet-sized space rocks would have spiraled into the sun. In other words, even if you could explain how the planetesimals formed, this still doesn't explain how Jupiter can exist today. Even as the asteroids formed, they'd be moving inwards, and asteroids that crash into the sun aren't available to make planets. There's another problem too. The solar nebula model predicts that these planetesimals would have contained certain chemical elements and would not contain certain other elements. But Jupiter's composition doesn't match these predictions. This is similar to the problem with Earth's water. Our planet has lots of water, but the secular model says it shouldn't, because water couldn't have condensed out of the nebula at Earth's distance from the Sun. Well, Jupiter has elements such as argon, krypton, xenon, and nitrogen, but those elements couldn't have condensed out of the nebula at Jupiter's distance from the Sun. In fact, Jupiter has about 3 to 4 times as much of these elements as secular scientists had expected. Secular models predict that Jupiter can't have these elements in the concentrations that we observe, because those elements can't have been in this part of the solar system back when Jupiter was forming. According to the models, the only place that these elements are allowed to have formed is way out beyond the edge of the solar system, billions of miles from where Jupiter is today. As one astronomer said, "It's actually something that started bothering me a few years ago. I can't think of any way to explain it if Jupiter formed where it currently is sitting." To try and solve this problem, some scientists have suggested that Jupiter must have formed much farther out from the Sun and then moved inward. But this doesn't make sense. Models say that there wouldn't have been enough material out there for Jupiter to assemble from. Others have suggested that the unexpected elements came from planetesimals, or asteroids, that formed way out there and then moved billions of miles inward, delivering these elements to Jupiter. But that doesn't work either. If they had formed out there and then moved in, they would have warmed up as they moved toward the Sun, and as they got warmer, they would have lost these elements. As some researchers commented, it remains to be shown how planetesimals that formed at the very low temperatures required to explain the observations could have found their way to Jupiter. Another proposal is that only Jupiter's core formed way out there and collected these elements and preserved them as it moved inwards, where it then collected gas to make the planet we see today. The problem here is that this only makes predictions about the composition of the core. It doesn't explain why we see these elements in Jupiter's atmosphere today. So this proposal also includes an asteroid collision to bring the elements up from the core into the outer part of the planet. But even some secular scientists are unimpressed by this idea. As one commented, "Well, you can use a giant impact to do anything."
And they do.
Secular models can't account for Jupiter, and this situation isn't new, because some of these problems have been known for decades. As one report said, "Talk about a major embarrassment for planetary scientists. There, blazing away in the late evening sky, are Jupiter and Saturn, the gas giants that account for 93% of the solar system's planetary mass, and no one has a satisfying explanation of how they were made." Well, that last part isn't true. The Bible has a very satisfying explanation of how they were made. But secular scientists reject the Bible, and so they're left scratching their heads over this beautiful planet.
Jupiter has 95 moons. We're going to review 4 of its largest moons. And think of the stars, we said. Every star is different. Every moon's different. So we're going to discuss Io, Europa, Callisto, and Ganymede. And the first one, the last one, we'll start first with Ganymede. It's the largest of Jupiter's moons. It's actually bigger than the planet Mercury. It's one of the most bizarre surfaces in our solar system. You can see crisscross with ridges and grooved terrain and strange patterns streaked across all of it. Some places are rough and rocky. Other places are flat and smooth, like you can see in the middle. It looks like somebody took a giant paintbrush and painted swipes across the surface. Evolutionary models say it can't have a magnetic field, but space probes found that it does have a magnetic field. Ganymede doesn't match the evolutionary model at all. The next moon is Callisto. It's the most heavily created object in the solar system. And evolutionists believe it has one of the oldest surfaces, 4 billion years old. But evolutionists expected a large number of small craters to go with the large ones. Well, the problem is there aren't any small craters. They should be there if the surface is billions of years old, but they are not. So Callisto does not match the evolutionary cratering model. Another thing they found on Callisto was pictures of fresh ice on the surface. So there's still erosion going on in Callisto, and geological activity is still going on. So evolutionary models, though, say Callisto is old, cold, and dead. Apparently, this isn't true. Let's look at the third moon of Jupiter, Europa. It's the opposite of Callisto. Callisto is one of the heaviest cratered object in the solar system, but Europa is the smoothest object in the solar system. Isn't it amazing how they're like opposite? It's like God's showing his creation ability, and each one is different. Another thing with Europa, it's covered with thick ice. I have a short clip where Spike goes into Europa's ice and impact to this secular cratering model.
But what is under the ice? There's some evidence that there could be liquid water deep under the surface. And where there's water, life can form, right? Wrong. Media reports often speculate about this, but it's not true. If water exists there, it only means that water exists there, and nothing more. As we discussed earlier, life cannot form from non-living chemicals unless it is made by a creator. Because Europa has only a few craters, we've been able to study them closely and get more understanding about how they form. Earlier in this video, we discussed how secular scientists use crater counting as an age indicator. The more craters there are, the longer the object has been sitting there getting hit by impacts. You might remember that the Earth's moon shows that crater counting doesn't work, because it assumes that craters form infrequently, but our moon shows that cratering rates were higher in the past. Well, Europa has revealed an additional problem for crater counting. It turns out that the impact of just one object can not only form one crater, it can also throw up debris and form many additional craters. One study showed that up to 95% of Europa's small craters, and a lot of the medium ones, were formed in this way. This means that our solar system's planets and moons have been struck with a lot fewer impacts than secular scientists had previously thought. And that calls into question all those billions of years that these objects have supposedly been around.
The fourth moon is Io. And this is an insignificant speck of a moon compared to Jupiter. But it has one of the most active volcanoes in the whole solar system. I have a short clip where Spike goes into Io's volcanic activity and how it's evidence for a young moon.
Compared to Jupiter, Io is an insignificant little speck of a moon. but it's turned out to be one of the most spectacular places in the solar system. Io's surface is covered with volcanoes. All the spots you see on its surface here are volcanic. Over 400 volcanoes have been counted on Io, and there are usually several erupting at any given time. The black spot you see here is a volcano named Loki. It's more powerful than all the Earth's volcanoes combined. Volcanoes on Io can be incredibly violent.
Look at the top
We've
of
seen
it.
fountains of lava blasting material
Lava's
180
being blasted
miles
out.
into space. We've also measured geysers of lava shooting out of the volcanoes at over 2,000 miles per hour. That's more than 10 times as fast as the most violent volcanoes here on Earth. Io gives us some insights into long-age theories. For example, Io puts out twice as much heat as the Earth does. Where does all this heat come from? Well, some of it comes from tidal flexing. Io is caught in a gravitational tug-of-war between Jupiter on the one side and Jupiter's other large moons on the other. They're all pulling on Io, and this squeezing and flexing is generating heat inside Io's interior. The problem is that this squeezing can only account for some of Io's heat. Plus, the volcanoes aren't distributed in the patterns that would be expected if tidal flexing was the only source of the heat. So where does the rest of it come from? Well, if Io was young, it could still be cooling off from its initial formation. But if it's really billions of years old, that energy would have dissipated long ago. So, according to secular theory, Io shouldn't have all those active volcanoes you see on its surface, but it does. Io's volcanoes create another problem for the models of billions of years. We've measured the lavas coming from the volcanoes, and there's an amazing amount of it. The Amirani volcano alone, which you see here, has flooded the moon's surface with 100 cubic meters of lava per second. It erupts like that frequently, and this isn't even the biggest volcano on Io. For example, look at these before and after pictures of the Pulan Patera. Between the times these photos were taken, there was a massive eruption that produced the dark spot you see on the upper right. That's a huge lava flow, about as big as the state of Nevada. And these flows happen quickly. We saw a different volcano produce almost this much lava in just 2 days. Has Io really been erupting like this for 4.5 billion years?
No.
We've measured some of these flows coming out of these volcanoes, and it's a huge amount of material. If Io really was 4.5 billion years old, it would have recycled itself through its own volcanoes over 30 times. Surely Io can't be billions of years old. And there's another problem too. We've studied volcanoes on Earth, and the lavas here reach amazing temperatures, 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At least these temperatures seemed amazing until we examined Io. Some of the lavas on Io are almost 1,000 degrees hotter than Earth lavas. They're also very dense. So here's the problem for long-age theories. If Io really were billions of years old, these temperatures and densities wouldn't be possible. After the first few million years, Io should have formed a low-density crust, after all the higher-density material sank down to the inside. But there are still high-density materials on the surface which haven't sunk yet. Forget about billions of years old. Io apparently isn't even millions of years old. Io looks quite young. It matches perfectly with the biblical account of creation just a few thousand years ago.
Do these moons from Jupiter, do they give off light like our moon?
To Jupiter, you mean? Give off light?
The moons around Jupiter, they give off light like our moon gives off light?
Yeah, a little light. Yeah, yep. That's a good question. Okay, so what you aren't being told about Jupiter. Summary. A fuzzy core. The secular model makes predictions about the structure of Jupiter's core, but the planet has a fuzzy core that does not match predictions. Number 2, the formation. The secular model says the core formed from planetesimals, but secular theories have great difficulty in explaining how those planetesimals would form. Even if they could form, they would have migrated into the sun, burning up, and leaving very few behind to make Jupiter. And the third point, composition. The model also says Jupiter can't be made up of the materials that it's made up of. What are you not being told about Jupiter's moons? Well, Ganymede shouldn't have a magnetic field, but it does. Callisto shouldn't be geologically active, and it has ice on it. Europa disproves long-age cratering counting, and Io looks very young. So the evolutionary model fail to explain Jupiter. And this is why evolutionists make complaints like this quote. Building Jupiter has long been a problem for theorists. And another evolutionist complains, saying this, I don't think the existence of Jupiter would be predicted if it weren't observed. So it shouldn't really even be out there, based on their model. So why do evolutionists cling to a broken model? Well, when you reject the truth in the Bible, you have to accept a lie, right? So we should pity the evolutionists because they're committed to a bankrupt theory so much that they cannot see the hand of the Creator in this majestic planet. So be thankful if you have the eyes to see the truth and not suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. The next planet is Saturn, and it's the second gas giant and is the sixth planet away from the sun. What's the most unique thing when you think of Saturn? Rings. Actually, if you were to look at a telescope at Saturn, if it was a clear night, you would see the rings. And they stick out. But what's amazing is, and I'll show you, those rings are so narrow. So Saturn's rings are one of the most famous sights in all of astronomy. The rings look solid, but they're not. They're made of millions of particles orbiting Saturn. And these particles are mostly ice and dirt, some small as grains of dust, and others are maybe the size of large boulders. Spike will talk about why evolutionists struggle to explain Saturn's rings. And some of the pictures are pretty amazing. And think of our Creator, because that's the only way you could think of how this made.
This series of pictures was taken as the Cassini spacecraft moved from below the rings to above them. You can see how thin the rings are. When
There's
you
a
compare
moon
their
going
width
by.
to their thickness,
See how
it's
narrow
about
it
the
is?
same as a sheet of paper that's as wide as a city. Saturn's rings are mysterious. They're more than just belts of particles orbiting the planet. For example, we've seen spokes in them, as you see here.
See the spokes?
Some of them are even braided. Nobody
Braided.
expected these features in the rings, and some of them are still a puzzle. It's as if somebody created them just to delight and fascinate us. So how did the rings get there? They might have been created at the same time Saturn was, a few thousand years ago. Of course, secular astronomers won't accept this. For a long time, the standard explanation was that Saturn's rings formed billions of years ago, along with the planet itself. But as we learned more about them, more problems arose with this view. For example, we've discovered that Saturn's rings are decaying. About 22,000 pounds of particles are falling onto Saturn every second. Also, Cassini found that the rings are accumulating dust as Saturn moves through space. This incoming material darkens the rings over time. However, the rings are still very bright, so there hasn't been enough time for them to get darker. This means that the rings can't be billions of years old. The maximum age is now said to be 100 million years, but that's a maximum age, not an absolute age. An age of 6,000 years fits the evidence too. Nevertheless, secular astronomers still believe that Saturn formed in a solar nebula. They think that for billions of years, Saturn didn't have a significant ring system at all, until something unlikely happened.
Guess what happened?
Yes, that's right. As a NASA article explained, a moon-sized object from the outer solar system might have flown nearby Saturn where tidal forces ripped it apart. Or maybe an asteroid smashed one of Saturn's existing moons. The debris encircled the planet and formed the rings we see today. Are you starting to detect a pattern in secular explanations? Not all scientists endorse this, though. There's a report from NASA on Saturn's rings that I think is interesting. Here's what it says. Saturn's rings, age and origin unknown.
Also, Saturn has a magnetic field which defies evolution. And this is a short clip that he'll explain.
Saturn causes other challenges for secular scientists. For one thing, its magnetic field shouldn't exist, according to their models. As a NASA report explained, according to everything scientists know about how planetary magnetic fields are generated, Saturn should not have one. It's a mystery that physicists will be working to solve. The main problem is that Saturn's magnetic field is, as this report says, at odds with scientists' theoretical understanding of how magnetic fields are generated. More specifically, it doesn't seem to be coming from a dynamo. This would be impossible if Saturn were billions of years old, as secular models assume. But there's no problem at all if Saturn is only thousands of years old, as the Bible says.
Also, there's gas giant formation and migration problem. And he'll explain this in more detail.
Here's another problem we need to discuss. In the chapter on Jupiter, we saw that one of the problems with the solar nebula model is that planetesimals wouldn't have formed a giant planet like Jupiter because they would have moved inwards and collided with the Sun instead. Well, that same problem applies to Saturn too. In fact, even if Jupiter and Saturn could somehow have formed, they wouldn't have been immune to the laws of physics afterwards. They too would have been subject to the same forces as the planetesimals, and they too would have moved inwards towards the Sun. After this problem was discovered, one report said, "These theories fail to describe the formation of gas giant planets in a satisfactory way. Gravitational interaction between the gaseous protoplanetary disk and the massive planetary cores causes them to move rapidly inward over about 100,000 years in what we call the migration of the planet in the disk. Theories predict that the giant protoplanets will merge into the central star before planets have time to form. This makes it very difficult to understand how they can form at all. Astronomers call this the migration problem. Jupiter and Saturn would have both migrated inwards and crashed into the Sun billions of years ago if that gas and dust story were true. The report concluded, understanding the formation of giant planets is currently one of the major challenges for astronomers. If the secular model says that Jupiter and Saturn shouldn't be there, but they are there instead, this is more than just a major challenge for the model. Many would say this falsifies the model completely. We see then that Saturn creates large problems for secular theorists.
And then we'll talk about its moons. Saturn has 62 moons, a little bit less than Jupiter. 53 are named, and 13 are greater than 30 miles in diameter. We'll review some key moons. Enceladus, Titan, and the dancing moons of Saturn. So Enceladus, this is an amazing moon. It's the 6th largest moon of Saturn, and the first close-up of the pictures were beautiful, and you can see a picture of it right there on the screen. And nobody expected what would come next. Enceladus has a fountain coming out of its south pole, and you can see it on that picture. If you use a polarized picture, it shows a large geyser coming out of the pole, and evolutionists were stunned, and the evolutionary models can't explain it. The moon is assumed to be billions of years old, but it has heat still in it, as we took these pictures. It's assumed to have cooled off eons ago because it's 4.5 billion years old. It's assumed to not have any energy left. And Enceladus's impact, its neighbor moons are much brighter than they're supposed to be. And that's what the pastor brought up about, do they show light? Well, with Enceladus spraying those geysers out, you know what they're doing? It's spray painting the surrounding moons with ice and snow. It's also a great piece of evidence for a young moon, and here's a short clip to highlight.
Tidal heating does not explain what we see on Enceladus. As a result, some scientists have tried explaining the moon's geysers with a giant asteroid impact, but this idea fails too. It might explain how the cracks formed, but it wouldn't explain the source of the energy for the geysers. Even some secular scientists admit how desperate this idea is. As these authors jokingly point out, a giant impact on Enceladus is the last refuge of the scoundrel. And by the way, scientists who believe in an old solar system not only have to explain the geyser's source of energy, they also have to explain how Enceladus could still have any liquid for the geysers to spray out. Enceladus apparently has an ocean underneath an outer shell of ice, But this isn't compatible with an age of billions of years either. Indeed, for astronomers who believe in billions of years, Enceladus is one of the great mysteries of planetary science. Long-age models say that Enceladus is old, cold, and dead, but it looks like it's none of those things. Enceladus is a great piece of evidence for a young solar system.
The next moon is Titan. Anybody ever hear of that name, Titan? As a moon, maybe? It's Saturn's largest moon, and it's unusually fuzzy, as you can see the picture right there. Its atmosphere is mostly nitrogen and some methane, but methane causes problems for evolutionary theories because the sunlight breaks methane down and fragment atoms reform into ethane and other chemicals. So methane would only last a few million years, not 4.5 billion years. And they thought that there would be a significant amount of methane on Titan today. So if Titan was billions of years old, it would have significant amount of accumulated ethane today from the methane broken down. Well, we sent out what's called a Cassini spacecraft. It was sent to visit Saturn and Titan. And evolutionists confidently predicted a deep global ocean of methane and ethane on Titan before they sent the spaceship there. And the predictions, of course, were based on billions of years of liquid accumulation of methane and ethane. They actually predicted an average depth of over a half mile deep of this methane and ethane. In fact, one scientific paper predicted the products of methane photolysis, a variety of simple and complex organic compounds, precipitate to Titan's surface, leaving a history of Titan's atmospheric composition. If Titan's atmosphere had existed in its present form since its formation, 800 meters, or approximately 1/2 mile of organic liquids in solids blanket the Titan's surface. He went further and said, one can calculate how much ethane has been produced on Titan over the entire history of the solar system. This remarkable moon could be covered by a global ocean of ethane with an average depth of up to several kilometers, which is miles. Well, we sent the probe there, and I'll show you a picture. Let's see if underneath that cloud there's oceans of ethane and methane over a half mile deep.
Scientists were taking a closer look at Titan from Earth, and they started to realize this prediction was wrong. Then, when Cassini's lander finally penetrated the haze, the truth was confirmed. Despite secular expectations, the probe landed on dry ground. Here's a photo of Titan's surface. There is no global ocean of methane and ethane on Titan. The surface is dry. We did find some lakes, mostly near the North Pole. It appears that at least some of them contain methane and ethane. However, they're still grossly inadequate to fulfill long-age requirements. As one study commented, even if the dark spots were all lakes of methane, the methane on Titan's surface would only be about 1/10 the amount in the atmosphere. This small amount would only last 10 million years at most, not 4,500 million years. Secular scientists have tried to revise their models, such as proposing that large amounts of methane and ethane are stored underneath Titan's surface, where we can't observe them. But these explanations have problems of their own. Oh, and something else that's not there is a lot of craters. Over billions of years, Titan should have accumulated thousands of them, but there are only a few. Titan doesn't look billions of years old. Titan looks quite young.
And the last on the Saturn's moons, Saturn has 2 dancing moons. When they go around Saturn, they switch order. And evolutionists can't explain that, but a creator God could do something like that.
You're looking at Janus and Epimetheus, 2 moons of Saturn. You might not think they look very impressive. The thing here isn't how they look, it's what they do. These are now called the dancing moons of Saturn. These 2 moons orbit Saturn in their separate paths, one on the inside and one on the outside. But then, every 4 years, they switch. The one on the outside moves to the inside, and the one on the inside moves to the outside. Isn't that wonderful? It's a silent, graceful ballet going on deep in space. This has to be precisely balanced in order to work. What are the odds of this happening by chance? I think this is a great testimony to our Creator.
So what you aren't being told about Saturn, it has a migration problem. Saturn and Jupiter were not formed by the nebula theory from that cloud of gas and dust, and computer simulations show both planets would have migrated into the sun billions of years ago. Saturn's magnetic field doesn't match evolutionary theories. Enceladus is young, Titan is young, and Saturn has dancing moons. Saturn tells us that our Creator is not only skilled, but he appreciates beauty. Uranus is the next planet, the third gas giant. It's so far away from the sun, it takes 84 Earth years to orbit the sun once. 84 years to orbit the sun. Voyager 2 flew by Uranus in 1986, and it showed Uranus defies evolutionary predictions in multiple ways. The picture here on the left is what you see how the planet appears to the naked eye. The picture on the right is the planet with false colors added to highlight details. Notice that red spot in the middle? The red spot is actually the planet's south pole. Notice it's tipped. Evolutionists expected Uranus poles to be on the top and bottom, like that picture shows, like all other planets. No, God in his creative, amazing ability instead put the poles on the sides. So Uranus leans way over as it orbits the sun. All other planets spin like a top as they orbit the sun, but no, Uranus rolls like a ball as it travels through space. And this creates a huge problem for evolution. And according to the nebula theory, it's impossible for Uranus to have formed this way. And I'll play another short clip from Spike about evolution's answer and the moons from Uranus.
Can you guess what the answer is? Yep, that's right. Uranus formed the right way up, as evolution predicts. But then an asteroid crashed into it and knocked it over. This was a really big asteroid, by the way, about the size of the entire Earth. But where's the evidence for this collision? There isn't any. In fact, there's lots of evidence that seems to be inconsistent with the collision. First of all, Uranus is quite stable as it rolls along through space. Its orbit around the sun is almost perfectly circular. Plus, its orbit lies more closely within the plane of the ecliptic than any other planet besides Earth. Surely a massive collision wouldn't have produced such a perfect orbit. Also, Uranus has moons, over 24 of them in fact, as you see here. Plus, it has a faint ring system. Notice that all these moons are orbiting Uranus's equator. Now remember, the equator is angled up and down, instead of sideways like the evolutionists expected. So where did these moons come from? They couldn't have formed before the collision because they wouldn't be orbiting where they are today. And they couldn't have formed after the collision because Uranus was supposedly already formed when the collision occurred. They couldn't even have formed during the collision because their orbits are too regular. They do not look like they were involved in any sort of collision like this. Here's what one scientist said about Uranus's moons. And by the way, this man won the Nobel Prize in Physics. He said, "To place the Uranian satellites in their present, almost coplanar circular orbits would require all the trajectory control sophistication of modern space technology. It is unlikely that any natural phenomenon involving bodies emitted from Uranus could have achieved this result." I think we should recognize that no collision occurred. Uranus was apparently created just the way it is.
Another thing that they found out, Uranus doesn't radiate energy into space.
Uranus causes lots of other problems for evolution too. First of all, Uranus is one of the 4 giant Jovian planets. The other 3 all generate energy. They radiate more energy into space than they receive from the sun. Uranus is the only giant planet that doesn't do this. But why doesn't it? After all, these planets all supposedly formed at the same time, from the same materials, by the same natural processes. That means they should have turned out roughly the same. But Uranus is very different than the others in this important area.
Also, Uranus has a magnetic field, and it generates very little heat. And most evolutionists expected Uranus to have little, if any, magnetic field. In 1984, 2 years before the Voyager 2 arrived at this planet, Dr. Russell Humphreys, who is a Bible-believing physicist, published an analysis of the planetary magnetism. So he actually forecast 2 years before it reached that planet that it would have a magnetic field. And what did he base it on? He based it on 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 5, where it says, "And the earth was formed standing out of water and in the water." Note, Dr. Humphreys said, what if all the planets were originally created from water? And this would have certain implications for their magnetic field today, meaning it could have it if it's 6,000 years old. But interesting, he tied this to the water in 2 Peter 3:5. He also predicted that the magnetic field would be 100,000 times stronger than the evolutionists were expecting. And when Voyager reached Uranus and took measurements, his prediction was right because he based it on the Bible. And all the evolutionary predictions were wrong. So here's creation scientists making predictions and being accurate. Uranus has 28 known moons. The most intriguing moon is Miranda. This moon is a tiny moon. It's 300 miles across. It's one of the strangest objects in the solar system. It looks like a patchwork quilt and appears almost glued together with a jumble of different pieces. Also, I have a short clip where he'll show Miranda's terrain. And if you look closely here, it's kind of a sideways check mark that God the Creator put on here. It's pretty amazing. And you can almost guess how the secularists believe that this was created.
How many different types of terrain can you identify here? There's long strips of rugged terrain, side by side with terrain that's smoother but more heavily cratered. Here's another example. Look at how dramatically the terrain changes from one section to another. It really looks like the moon was assembled from a bunch of separate pieces. Some sections look like someone painted it with a giant paintbrush. Other sections have very dramatic terrain, with canyons several miles deep. Let's look more closely at that cliff on the right. This cliff is about 6 miles high. Imagine standing at the top and looking down. And what's with that big check mark anyway? It's almost as if the Creator said, "Ha! Let him try to explain this one."
This is what a secular scientist said. No one predicted anything looking like Miranda. Another quote, "The central problem in modeling the thermal histories of the Uranian satellites is accounting for Miranda." So what do evolutionists, or how do evolutionists explain Miranda?
You're probably expecting me to say they explain it with an asteroid collision. Nope, not this time. Miranda is so weird, even the evolutionists admit that an asteroid collision won't help them. Instead, some evolutionists propose 5 collisions. Here's a quote from a NASA website. "Scientists believe that Miranda may have been shattered as many as 5 times during its evolution. After each shattering, the moon would have reassembled from the remains of its former self, with portions of the core exposed and portions of the surface buried." If this sounds like nonsense, it's because it is. Even other evolutionists recognize that this tiny moon wouldn't necessarily survive 1 collision, never mind 5. As one evolutionary astronomer wrote, "Although some sort of collisional disruption appears to be required, it's not obvious that the present terrain, with relief up to 20 kilometers, would survive catastrophic disruption and reassembly." Maybe that's why that NASA website, after telling you about the 5 collisions, says this: Miranda's appearance can be explained by theories, but the real reason is still unknown. So first, they give you a theory, and then admit they actually don't know what happened. In other words, they made up a story and told it to you, even though they know it's not true. Wouldn't it be better just to acknowledge that these objects were created?
So what you aren't being told about Uranus. Evolution teaches it shouldn't be rotating sideways like a ball, but it is. Evolution teaches it shouldn't have a magnetic field, but it does, and a creation scientist forecasted it. Evolution implies it should be radiating energy into space, but it's not. And Miranda, its moon, is a mystery for evolutionary models. So the final gas giant is Neptune, and it's the 8th planet from the Sun, and it has 16 known moons. According to the evolutionary models, the planet should be old, cold, and dead 4.5 billion years ago. However, Neptune doesn't look old, cold, or dead. Neptune isn't cold. Space probes discovered it is not as cold as evolutionists expected. The planet radiates into space twice the energy it receives from the sun. If you're expending more energy, it would eventually run out of energy because it's so far away from the sun it can't receive the sun's energy. So that proves it's young. And it's not dead. It's a violent, turbulent planet. In fact, the strongest winds measured anywhere in the solar system is on Neptune. And there's measured wind speeds up to 1,300 miles per hour. And Neptune also has a great dark spot. It's a giant storm the size of Earth, or at least it was. Measured wind speed up to 1,300 miles. The Hubble Space Telescope by 1994 showed the dark spot was gone. The next year, the dark spot was discovered in another location. So Neptune is a dynamic, changing planet. And it isn't old because Neptune has a magnetic field. And the Voyager discovered the magnetic field. Neptune's field is the same way as Uranus. But this is what Astronomy magazine explained. Uranus and Neptune shouldn't even exist. They say, psst, astronomers who modeled the formation of the solar system have kept a dirty little secret. Uranus and Neptune don't exist. Or at least the computer simulations have never explained how planets as big as the two gas giants could form so far from the sun. Bodies orbited slowly in outer parts of the sun's protoplanetary disk, that the slow process of gravitational accretion would need more time than the age of the solar system to form bodies with 14.5 and 17.2 times the mass of the Earth. And this will be my last clip where Spike talks about evolution, that Uranus and Neptune don't exist.
According to evolution, Uranus and Neptune don't exist. Well, last time I checked, both planets were still up there in the sky. Evolutionists are unhappy that their model is such a failure. As one evolutionary astronomer has commented, what is clear is that simple banging together of planetesimals to construct planets takes too long in this remote outer part of the solar system. The time needed exceeds the age of the solar system. We see Uranus and Neptune, but the modest requirement that these planets exist has not been met by this model. Let's ask an important question here. How long has this problem been known? Here's another evolutionist. There have been many attempts to model the evolution of a swarm of colliding planetesimals. Safronov calculated the characteristic timescales for planetary growth. In the terrestrial region, he found timescales of 10 to the 7 years. That's a 1 with 7 zeros after it. But the time estimates increased rapidly in the outer regions of the solar system and was 10 to the 10 years for Neptune, which is twice the age of the solar system. It is clear that in view of the large timescales found for the formation of the outer planets, a satisfactory theoretical model for the accretion of planets from diffuse material is not available at present. Okay, so this problem was first discovered by a scientist named Safronov. Was this a recent discovery? Nope. Safronov published this in 1972. So evolutionists have known for over 30 years that Uranus and Neptune can't exist, according to their models. Did you hear about this in Time magazine, or in the newspaper, or in a science program? I bet you haven't. In fact, I bet you've been told the opposite. I bet you've been told that evolutionists have the entire solar system figured out, and that they know exactly how it all formed all by itself billions of years ago. Now you know that this is a falsehood. Here's a quote from another evolutionary astronomer. He says this: "It's clear that our level of sophistication of studying planet formation is relatively primitive. So far, it's been very difficult for anybody to come up with a scenario that actually produces Uranus and Neptune. Come up with a scenario. That's a very interesting statement. In fact, it really reveals the heart of the matter. The goal of the evolutionist is to come up with a scenario about how everything got here without a creator being involved. Most evolutionists even seem to believe that just the act of coming up with a story proves it all happened that way. It doesn't even have to be a good story. Just look at what's going on with Uranus and Neptune. Instead of acknowledging their creator, evolutionists would rather cling to a story that denies the very objects it's supposed to explain. Evolutionists need to make up stories about how evolution could have made the planets. How much worse of a story could you come up with than one that says the planets can't exist? Uranus and Neptune prove that it doesn't matter how bad the story is. For the evolutionist, any story is better than acknowledging the truth about their creator. These planets reveal the truth about the creation versus evolution debate. This is not a debate about religion versus science. If it were, there wouldn't be any scientists who believed in creation. But there are hundreds of degreed scientists who do believe in creation.
3,000.
No, this is a debate about the authority of the Bible as God's Word. The Bible explains the scientific data far better than the evolutionary model. Plus, the Bible's truth is supported by evidence from archaeology, geology, history, and many other sources. Not to mention that as the Word of God, the Bible stands on its own authority anyway. But none of that matters to evolutionists. Evolutionists have rejected the Bible because they don't want to be accountable to a creator. They would rather believe a model that says the gas giant planets cannot exist. You can decide for yourself whose model is the better match for the scientific evidence.
So what you aren't being told about Neptune? It looks young, not billions of years old. It generates energy. It's changing constantly with its spot. And it has the highest winds in the entire solar system. Its magnetism defies evolution. And according to evolution, it can't be there at all. So before I close, any comments or questions on this?
Which planet was the largest?
Jupiter.
Jupiter is the largest.
Jupiter's the largest.
How does that compare in size to Earth?
I did have a picture showing the size earlier. Really. Okay, you can see this. This is the giant red spot. It was that size. Yeah. Yeah, it might be even smaller than the red spot, right, Michelle? Any other comments? And I'll have some quiz questions. All right. I tried to make them easy. 1, true or false? According to evolution, Jupiter can't be made up of what it's made up of. Anyone want to guess on true or false on that? True, yes. True. No planetesimals were available to build Jupiter. Evolution stated, I don't think the existence of Jupiter would be predicted if it were observed. So yes. Question number 2. Evolutionists cannot explain Saturn's rings. What do they say caused the rings? Remember the trumpets? Huh? It's asteroid. Asteroid collision. Remember they said a moon-sized object from outer space. But the Bible teaches Saturn was created on day 4. Therefore, the rings were created with the planet. Remember the picture? They're so narrow. In fact, the stuff's falling onto the planet. And it's getting dirty with the dust. It's young. Question 3. Which way does Uranus rotate as it orbits the sun? Anybody remember that?
Sideways?
Yes. Sideways like a ball. Yep. Very good. All other planets spin like a top as they orbit the sun, but Uranus rolls like a ball sideways. Last question. True or false? Secular scientists believe Uranus and Neptune should not exist. Yep. Isn't it amazing? and how he summarized it. Astronomy magazine stated, astronomers who model the formation of the solar system have kept a dirty little secret. They don't exist, or at least their computer simulations have never explained how planets this big could form so far from the sun. Instead of acknowledging a creator, they would rather cling to their story that denies the very planets it's supposed to explain. So in 2 weeks, lesson 4, our created solar system with Trans-Neptunian objects and comets. The end. Thank you for your attention.